motives of serial killers are incomprehensible to ordinary people. Maniacs can hide in plain sight for years, and the number of their victims can number in the dozens. Today, I will talk about one of the most famous maniacs in American history. I chose this man because he represents a certain benchmark for a serial killer. He managed to go into hiding for 30 years, and in all that time, he was never once a suspect. The setting is Central America, Kansas, the city of Wichita. It is the largest city in the state, although it is not really that big. In 1974, only 300,000 people lived there. On January 5th, on a chilly winter afternoon, 15-year-old Charlie Otero was walking home from school. His family had moved to Wichita only a year earlier when the family's father retired. Father Joseph Otero is a Spanish-speaking immigrant from Puerto Rico. He had served almost his entire life in the U.S. Army, and along with his wife and 5 children, had chosen the township to face old age in peace. Wichita seemed like a quiet place, with no murders or robberies and no street gangs, but that day, everything changed. Charlie opened the door, stepped inside, and saw something that changed his life forever. His mother and father were sitting in the living room, and they were tied tightly to chairs and strangled. On the second floor, Charlie found his 9-year-old brother tied up with a plastic bag over his head and his 11-year-old sister hanging from a heating pipe. Nothing like this had ever happened in the city before. The murder had been committed with extreme brutality and cold-bloodedness. When police arrived on the scene, they found virtually no evidence. Detectives determined that the murder occurred around 9 a.m., and none of the victims resisted until they were tied to a chair. Furthermore, a large dog lived in the house, but neighbors heard no barking. A live and healthy dog was later found in the backyard. It all seemed strange. How did the killer manage to cope with a former military man who was also a multiple champion boxer? Probably somehow, the victims were convinced that if they obeyed, their lives would be safe. All the tools the killer brought with him were rope, scissors, and wire cutters, and then he took them back. The telephone wire was cut, and witnesses saw nothing and heard nothing. Only one person was found who claimed to have seen a black man driving away from the house in the victim's car. All of this led police officers to believe that the murder was pre-planned. Otero's family were not random victims. The perpetrator chose them deliberately. But who might have had a motive remains a mystery. There were no signs of sexual assault, although the killer left semen traces everywhere, which means there was a sexual subtext. The last thing detectives were able to establish is that the real target of the criminal was his 11-year-old daughter, Josephine Otero. The others were just collateral victims. Police Chief Floyd Hannon said in a January 1974 interview with the Wichita Eagle, a local newspaper, that the method in which the family was killed indicates a marked tendency toward fetishism on the part of the assailant. No one knew then that this was the first case of the man who would become one of America's most wanted criminals for many years to come. On April 4, 1974, just 3 months after the murder of the Otero family, 20-year-old Catherine Bright and her 19-year-old brother Kevin returned to their home around 1 a.m. An uninvited guest was in the house at the time and was waiting for Catherine to return. The guest told them that he needed money in a car because he needed to flee from the California police who were looking for him. At gunpoint, Kevin was forced to tie his sister to a chair and then was taken to another room where the perpetrator tied him up and put a gag in his mouth. A few minutes later, the man tried to strangle Kevin with a rope but encountered fierce resistance before shooting Kevin twice with a gun. He survived and could hear screams for help coming from the next room where his sister was. Kevin tried to free himself and come to her aid, but he couldn't, and his sister died 5 hours later in the hospital due to stab wounds. Police noted that Catherine was partially naked and also had distinct strangulation marks. Kevin assisted the police in describing the perpetrator, but he was never found. At the time, police did not connect the case in any way to the Otero family case. 9 months after the murder, in September 1974, detectives managed to apprehend 3 punks who confessed to the killing. But a month later, in October, Wichita Eagle reporter Don Granger received an anonymous call, allegedly from the Otero family's killer. The caller told him to look at a mechanical engineering textbook in the Wichita Public Library. Inside the book, Granger found a letter confessing to killing the Otero family and assuring that the murders would continue. That it was the killer who wrote the letter was obvious, as it contained details that could only be known to the police and the real culprit. The unidentified killer claimed that those 3 suspects in the murder of the Otero family did not commit the crime. The following excerpts from the letter, with the original language retained, were published in a local newspaper.
I am writing this letter to you as a conscientious taxpayer. These 3 dudes who are in the pipeline right now are just blabbing the public about the murder of the Otero family. They don't know anything. I did it on my own, and nobody helped me. There's nothing to say. Let me spell it out clearly for you.
The killer went on to give details of the crime that were never published, but were accurate.
I apologize to the public that this happened. They certainly suffered a lot. It's hard for me to control myself. You might call me a deranged lunatic and a sexually perverted person. I never knew the moment when the monster would come to my mind again, but it stays here. Is anyone capable of self-healing? If you ask for help, say you killed 4 people, people will laugh or rush to call the police in a panic. I can't stop a monster when it comes and hurts me and society. Society should be thankful that there are opportunities whereby people like me can take a load off by simply imagining in our dreams how some victims are suffering. A big and intricate game, dear friends, diminishes the victims. The monster is stalking them, following them, waiting in the dark, waiting. The pressure is intense, and sometimes I let it come out. Maybe you can stop it. I can't. He's already chosen his next victim or victims. I don't know who they are yet. I'll find out the day after I read the paper, but it will be too late.
Although the letter was unsigned, it contained the following postscript.
Since sex offenders do not, or by nature cannot, change their modus operandi from the Latin for way of acting, I will not change mine. The code word for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK. You'll see it again. It will be written on the next victim.
3 years later, on March 17, 1977, Wichita police were called to 1311 South Hydraulic Street. Upon arrival, police officers entered the house and found 26-year-old Shirley Vian dead. She was lying on her bed, partially undressed. Her legs and arms were bound, and around her neck officers found a cord signed BTK. The perpetrator had locked Shirley's 3 children in the bathroom. The children somehow managed to free themselves and call the police. Once again, investigators believed the murder was meticulously prepared. It all happened during the day, and there was no sign of forced entry. From that moment on, the city of Wichita was plunged into an unaccountable panic. Hundreds of people were returning home from work in the evening, and the first thing they did was check to see if their phone service was working. Cutting telephone wires had already become a trademark of the BTK. Working women hurried home and locked themselves up. The BTK instantly became a sinister story, told to the uninitiated in bars and at parties. On December 8, 1977, BTK called the emergency dispatch line. He told the dispatcher,
"Go to this address, where you will find the body of the murdered Nancy Fox."
This call was traced to a phone booth located downtown, near which witnesses were found who testified that shortly before, they had seen a blonde-haired man taller than 180 centimeters. Following the caller's instructions, officers rushed to the address S. Pershing 843. Upon arriving there, officers immediately saw a broken window through which the killer had entered the home. Upon entering the home, they found the body of 25-year-old Nancy Fox in her bedroom, her nylon stockings twisted around her neck. Unlike the previous victims, she was fully clothed. Fox's driver's license was missing from the scene, as was Joseph Otero's watch. Again, investigators speculated that the killer took a trophy with him as a memento of the murder. The murder occurred at night and traces of semen were found at the crime scene, but an autopsy revealed that Fox had not been raped. On February 10, 1978, a local TV station received a letter.
How many more murders do I have to kill before I see my name in the papers or get some national attention?
In this letter, the unidentified man confessed to 7 murders, naming Nancy Fox as his latest victim. One of the 7 victims thus remained unnamed. According to the Wichita Eagle, even though investigators in the case could not document the killer's confessions, they took him at his word and assumed that the 7th victim was Catherine Bright. In addition to his statements, the killer attributed his crimes to the presence of a demon in his head and the mystical X factor. He stated that he regretted the murders he had committed and the monster that was possessing his thoughts. He also warned that he had already chosen his next victim. The last confirmed incident involving BTK occurred on April 28, 1979, when he waited at 600 South Pinecrest Street for the owner of the house, a 63-year-old woman. When she did not show up at the scheduled time, BTK became angry and wrote her a note, which he wrapped in one of her own scarves.
You're lucky you weren't here, because I was.
The search for BTK had gradually died by the early 1980s, as no new clues or crimes were linked to him. The new victim appeared on October 31, 1987. 10 years had passed since the previous murder. The body of 15-year-old Shannon Olson was found in a pond in an industrial area of the city, and it was partially naked. Several stab wounds were the cause of death. Her hands and feet were bound. Years went by. The results of the investigation were nil. Police and the FBI spent 100,000 man-hours working on hundreds of versions, but all in vain. By the end of the 20th century, the FBI officially recognized the BTK serial killer case as one of the most complex and unsolvable. It was as if they were facing a new Jack the Ripper, who, I might remind you, had never been found. In the early 2000s, the BTK case was closed. The police concluded that the maniac was probably dead. After 25 years of silence, BTK began terrorizing Wichita again. The killer made himself known on March 19, 2004 by sending a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper. According to reporters in it, he confessed to a murder committed on September 16, 1986. The victim was Vicky Wegerle. The letter was accompanied by photocopies of Wegerle's driver's license and 3 photographs of her body. After that, BTK began not just sending letters to the police and media, but also leaving packages in random places around the city. For example, he taped one of them to a road sign in the center of town. BTK's messages consisted of puzzles, revelations about old murders, and threats to commit new crimes. The maniac complained that he was already quite old, so he could hardly cope with a young girl, so he looked for a weaker victim. BTK also told quite a lot of information about himself, for example, that he lived in a 3-story building and the elevator was booby-trapped in case they came looking for him. Sometimes this information contradicted each other, so it soon became clear that the killer was just trying to confuse the police. BTK hid one of his last letters in a cereal packet and discreetly planted it in a random car in a parking lot. This was the first serious lead in 30 years of the investigation. The fact is that in 2004, Wichita already had surveillance cameras in many neighborhoods, and one such camera was near the parking lot where BTK left the letter. This was the first time detectives could see the legendary maniac with their own eyes. A white man threw a box of cereal into someone else's car and then got into a black Jeep Cherokee and drove off. Unfortunately, the quality of the video was so poor that the detectives could hardly even identify the model of the car BTK. Of course, the face and license plate number could not be seen. On February 16, 2005, BTK, instead of sending a letter for the first time, sent a floppy disk with text written on it. The floppy disk was immediately given to a computer specialist, and they found a deleted file on it without any problems, written on behalf of the Lutheran Church of Wichita. The metadata indicated that the last person to make changes to the document was someone named Dennis. The police immediately recognized that the church board president of this church was Dennis Rader, an elderly man and a model family man, father of 2 grown children. The police decided to observe him, and just that same day, it was discovered that Dennis Rader was driving a black Jeep Cherokee. To make sure they found BTK, the cops needed a DNA test, but how do you ask Dennis Rader to take the test and not scare him off? It turned out that Carrie Rader's daughter had recently been tested at a clinic, and there were samples of her DNA left behind. The police got a warrant for testing, and bingo, there could be no mistake. Dennis Rader, an exemplary Christian, decent husband and father, was a BTK serial maniac who murdered 10 people with extreme brutality. On February 25, 2005, when Dennis Rader was on his way home for lunch, the police were waiting for him. He did not resist and surrendered without any emotion. During the search, they found the victims' belongings and many photos of Dennis posing in front of the corpses or their clothes. The investigation was completed. At first, Rader refused to plead guilty, but when the detectives pretended to admire his amazing talent for killing and remaining undetected, Rader began to reveal everything he knew. He believed he had finally found an appreciative audience in the form of police officers who could appreciate his skills. Rader believed that he and the police were playing an intellectual game, like in the movies. At the second trial, Rader fully pleaded guilty and, for half an hour, live on air to an audience of millions, detailed how and whom he killed. He referred to the murders as projects and seemed to feel no remorse. At the end of the trial on August 18, 2005, Dennis Rader was sentenced to the maximum possible sentence, 10 life sentences with parole after 175 years. For 18 years, he has been sitting in solitary confinement in the El Dorado County Jail, just a few kilometers from the car dealership where the grown-up Charlie Otter works. The man who discovered the bodies of his parents, who were the first victims of the maniac. The story of Dennis Rader is impossible to understand if you do not know what a psychopath is. This person is pathologically unable to sympathize with others and is completely fixated only on himself and his goals. Psychopaths have no problem hurting other people and feel no guilt for it. Dennis Rader was a classic psychopath. What distinguished him from others was that he learned to live perfectly in 2 worlds. In the first, he was an honest American, and in the second, a terrible murderer.